A lonely rancher takes in a desperate bride rejected at the railway station, standing against a powerful banker and town gossip to protect her. But what truly shocked everyone wasn't their unusual arrangement. It was what happened next. The first thing Thomas felt that morning was pain. His back ached as he rolled out of bed in his empty house. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window, lighting up dancing specks in the air. Thomas hadn't bothered to clean in weeks. What was the point when nobody ever visited? He splashed cold water on his face, the shock waking him fully. In the cracked mirror, a stranger with tired eyes looked back. At 42, lines cut deep across his forehead and around his mouth. Not smile lines. Thomas Blackwell hadn't had much to smile about since losing his wife and baby boy 12 years ago. Another day, he mumbled to himself, scratching his beard. His voice sounded strange in the quiet house. Sometimes he went days without speaking to anyone except his horses and cattle. Outside, the September sun already blazed hot, though it wasn't yet 8 o'clock. The sky stretched endless blue above his small ranch, 100 acres of mostly decent grazing land with a 2-room cabin he'd built with his own hands. Later, he'd added another room, though he never used it. It just stood there, a monument to hopes that died long ago. Thomas had a list of chores waiting, but today he needed supplies from town. His coffee was down to the last few grounds, and his flour had weevils. The thought of the 12-mile journey to Millbrook didn't improve his mood. After feeding the animals and loading the wagon, Thomas set off. The wheels creaked and complained over every rock and hole in the dirt road. His 2 workhorses, Samson and Delilah, plodded forward without needing much direction. They knew the way. As he drove, Thomas noticed changes in the land. The summer had been unusually dry. Brown patches spread across fields that should have been green. If rain didn't come soon, everyone would struggle through winter. "Gonna be a hard one," he told Samson, who flicked an ear back but kept walking. The closer Thomas got to town, the more he felt that familiar tightness in his chest. He didn't like being around people much. They asked too many questions, gave him looks of pity or worse, tried to introduce him to sisters, cousins, or friends who needed a good man. Millbrook wasn't much as towns went. A main street with 24 buildings, most made of wood with false fronts trying to look bigger than they were. The general store, saloon, and bank stood at the center, with smaller shops and houses spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Thomas usually timed his visits to avoid the train's arrival. Too many people, too much noise and bustle. But today, as he approached the outskirts of town, he heard the distant whistle blowing. "Just our luck," he grumbled. Now he'd have to wait for the commotion to die down before he could get his supplies in peace. The train station sat at the east end of town, a simple wooden platform with a small building where Elijah Jones, the station master, sold tickets and handled telegrams. As Thomas drove past, he couldn't help noticing a small crowd gathering. Something about their posture made him pull his horses to a stop. People stood in tight clusters, whispering behind hands and shooting glances toward the platform. Thomas recognized Mrs. Peterson from the bakery, her round face pinched with disapproval. Beside her, the blacksmith's wife nodded at whatever she was saying. Curiosity, a feeling Thomas didn't often allow himself, made him secure the wagon and walk closer. "Afternoon, Thomas," called Elijah, stepping off the platform. His gray hair stuck out from under his cap, and his railroad uniform looked like he'd slept in it. "Didn't expect to see you in town on train day." "Needed supplies," Thomas replied. "What's everyone looking at?" Elijah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Another mail-order bride," he said, keeping his voice low. "Third one this month. This one's for Harrison. Willard Harrison." The name made Thomas's jaw tighten. Harrison owned the bank that held the mortgage on Thomas's ranch, along with half the businesses in town. A wealthy man who flaunted his money with fancy clothes and a big house on the hill. Twice widowed already, though no one spoke about how his wives had died. "Poor girl doesn't know what she's in for," Elijah added. "Man's gone through 2 wives already." Before Thomas could respond, the train whistle blew again. Closer now. Black smoke puffed into the clear blue sky as the engine rolled into view. Metal wheels screeched against the tracks as the train slowed. Something made Thomas stay instead of continuing to the store. Maybe it was the memory of his own arrival in Millbrook 15 years ago, young and full of dreams with his new bride beside him. Maybe it was just the break in his lonely routine. The train hissed to a stop, belching steam that wrapped around the platform like morning fog. Passengers began stepping down. A drummer with sample cases, a family with 3 tired children, a young man in a city suit looking anxiously around. And then she appeared. She stepped carefully from the train car, one gloved hand gripping the rail. The first thing Thomas noticed was how she held herself. Straight-backed and proper, but something in her eyes looked ready to bolt like a spooked horse. Her blue traveling dress had seen better days, its hem dusty and wrinkled from the journey. She wore a sensible bonnet that couldn't quite contain her honey-brown hair, strands of which had escaped to frame a face that looked too young for the serious expression it wore. In one hand, she clutched a small valise like it contained everything she owned in the world. Maybe it did. As she scanned the platform, Thomas saw hope flicker across her face, quickly replaced by uncertainty. She was looking for someone who wasn't there. "Miss Charlotte Edwards?" Elijah called, stepping forward with a telegram in hand. The young woman's shoulders straightened even more, if that was possible. "Yes, sir. That's me." Even from where he stood, Thomas could hear the slight tremble in her voice. Not fear exactly, but the sound of someone forcing themselves to be brave. "I'm here to meet Mr. Harrison," she added, her words carrying a trace of an Eastern accent. Elijah's weather-beaten face tightened. He twisted his cap in his hands, never a good sign. "I'm afraid there's been a situation, Miss Edwards. Mr. Harrison sent word this morning. He's changed his mind about the arrangement." The color drained from the young woman's face. For a long moment, she stood frozen on the platform as whispers rippled through the onlookers. Thomas saw several women exchange looks of smug satisfaction. Others showed pity, but no one stepped forward. Charlotte Edwards blinked rapidly, her chin lifting as she fought for composure. "I see," she said, her voice now barely audible over the hissing of the cooling train. "And the next train east?" "Not for 3 days, ma'am. We only get the eastbound on Tuesdays and Fridays." The woman's white-knuckled grip on her valise tightened. "Is there somewhere I might stay until then?" Elijah shuffled uncomfortably, avoiding her eyes. "The boarding house is full with the harvest hands, and the hotel." He didn't need to finish. Everyone knew Harrison owned the hotel. Charlotte Edwards stood alone on that platform, a stranger in a strange place, rejected before she'd even had a chance. Something about her dignified struggle to maintain composure stirred a feeling in Thomas he thought long buried. He found himself stepping forward before he'd formed a clear thought. "I have a spare room, ma'am," he heard himself say. "It's not much, but it's clean." Every head turned his way, including Charlotte's. Her blue eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been suspicion. "That's very kind, but I couldn't possibly," she began. "It's 12 miles out of town," Thomas continued, suddenly aware of the stairs. "My ranch. The room's been sitting empty for years. You're welcome to it until the train comes." Mrs. Peterson gasped dramatically. The whispers grew louder. "Thomas Blackwell," she hissed. "What are you thinking? It wouldn't be proper." But Thomas kept his eyes on Charlotte, whose face showed a battle between pride and practicality. "I don't accept charity, Mr. Blackwell," she said quietly. "It's not charity," he replied. "I could use help around the place. Consider it a fair trade, work for room and board for 3 days." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. "In that case, I accept your offer, sir." And just like that, Thomas Blackwell's quiet, lonely life changed course, though neither he nor Charlotte Edwards could possibly imagine how completely. "Get in. Quick." Thomas Blackwell's urgent voice cut through Charlotte's swirling thoughts as fat raindrops began pelting the wagon. She hadn't noticed the dark clouds gathering during their silent journey from town. Charlotte scrambled onto the wooden seat, clutching her valise against her chest like armor. The heavens opened with perfect dramatic timing, as if to wash away her old life and drench her in this strange new reality. "Won't last long," Thomas said, the first words he'd spoken in nearly an hour. "These summer storms blow through fast." Charlotte nodded stiffly, raindrops sliding down her cheeks, mixing with tears she refused to acknowledge. What choice did she have but to trust this stranger? A man who lived alone miles from town, who now controlled her fate until the eastbound train arrived. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating Thomas's profile. In that brief flash, Charlotte studied him. Weathered skin stretched over strong bones, eyes focused straight ahead, hands steady on the reins. Not handsome like Willard Harrison had appeared in his photographs, but solid. Dependable looking, but appearances lied. Harrison's letters had painted him as a respectable businessman seeking a practical partner. A man of standing who needed a wife to help manage his affairs. The photographs he'd sent showed a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes. How easily she'd been fooled. The wagon hit a deep rut, jolting Charlotte back to the present. Her stomach growled loudly enough for Thomas to hear despite the rain. "Been traveling long?" he asked, eyes still on the muddy road ahead. 3 days, Charlotte admitted. "From Pennsylvania. Long way." "Yes." More silence. Charlotte didn't mind. Words seemed pointless now. What could she possibly say? That she'd sold most of her possessions to buy a train ticket west? That after her brother's new wife made it clear there was no place for her in their home, she'd answered an advertisement in the matrimonial news as a last resort? Respectable businessman seeks practical, educated lady as wife. Must be of good character, healthy, and willing to relocate to thriving Western community. Age 20 to 30 preferred. How desperate she must have seemed in her reply. How pathetic. The rain eased as they crested a hill, revealing a modest homestead below. A solid cabin with a newer addition built on one side, a small barn, a corral where several horses grazed. Not the grand house Harrison had described in his letters, but tidy and well-maintained. "It's not what you're probably used to," Thomas said, misreading her expression. "But the roof doesn't leak much, except in the kitchen corner when the wind blows from the north." Charlotte swallowed hard. "Mr. Blackwell, it appears I'm not going to be used to anything I expected. Your home looks perfectly sound." He gave her a quick, searching glance, then nodded once. The rain had stopped completely by the time they reached the yard. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her more than necessary. His rough fingers barely brushed her elbow, but Charlotte felt the contact like a brand. How long since anyone had touched her, even so innocently. "I'll show you where you'll stay," he said, leading her toward the cabin while carrying her valise despite her protests. Inside, Charlotte found herself in a simple main room with a stone fireplace, wooden table with 4 chairs, and a rocking chair beside a small bookshelf. Everything was clean but spartanly furnished. No photographs, no decorative touches, nothing to suggest a woman's presence, or that anyone really lived here rather than just existed. Thomas walked to a door on the far side. "This is the extra room," he said, pushing it open. "Built it thinking." He stopped, clearing his throat. "Anyway, it's yours while you're here." The small bedroom contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers with a porcelain washbasin, and a braided rug on the plank floor. A window looked out toward distant hills. "The outhouse is out back," Thomas continued awkwardly. "I'll bring fresh water for washing. Stoves in the kitchen through there. Feel free to use anything you need." Charlotte set her hat on the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by the strange intimacy of being in this man's home. "Mr. Blackwell, I want to make sure you understand my situation correctly. I came here expecting to be married. I am not." She felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to continue. "I am not a woman of loose morals finding herself in unfortunate circumstances. I was misled by Mr. Harrison." Thomas's expression didn't change. "Never thought otherwise, Miss Edwards. Nevertheless, people will talk. Your reputation—" "Got no reputation to speak of," he interrupted. "Keep to myself mostly. Don't much care what folks in town think." Charlotte smoothed her rumpled skirt. Well, I care about mine. I'll work for my keep as agreed, but I'll be on that train Friday. Something flickered across Thomas's face. Relief, perhaps? Of course. Now, you must be hungry. I was going to make a simple supper. Please allow me, Charlotte said quickly. I'm a capable cook. It's the least I can do. In the small kitchen, Charlotte found meager supplies: beans, flour, coffee, some salted pork. She managed to create a passable meal while Thomas tended his animals. They ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't as uncomfortable as Charlotte expected. After supper, Thomas brought her a lamp. I rise at dawn, he said, but sleep as long as you need. You've had a difficult day. Once alone in the spare room, Charlotte finally allowed her carefully maintained composure to crack. Tears came in a flood as she curled on the unfamiliar bed, muffling her sobs in the quilt. Everything she'd planned, every hope she'd cautiously nurtured during that long train journey west, all destroyed before she'd taken 10 steps in Millbrook. Morning light filtered through the window when Charlotte next opened her eyes. For a moment, she was disoriented. This wasn't the train, nor any place she recognized. Then yesterday's events crashed back. She'd been rejected, abandoned in a strange town, taken in by a solitary rancher who was now, by the sounds coming through the thin walls, making breakfast. Charlotte rose quickly, smoothing her hair and changing into her one other dress, a simple brown cotton that had seen better days. She wouldn't appear helpless or ungrateful. In the kitchen, Thomas stood at the stove, his back to her. Coffee's hot, he said without turning. Figured you might want some after your journey. Thank you, Charlotte said, composing her face into what she hoped was a pleasant, neutral expression. Mr. Blackwell, I meant what I said about working. Can cook, clean, mend. I was raised on a farm before. She trailed off, unwilling to share more of her history. Thomas turned, studying her with those steady gray eyes. Call me Thomas, he said finally. And there's plenty needs doing around here, if you're sure. Completely sure. Charlotte squared her shoulders. I've never been afraid of hard work, Mr. Thomas. His mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Then we'll get along fine, Miss Edwards. Charlotte, she corrected. If they were to be on a first-name basis, it would go both ways. After breakfast, Charlotte tackled the cabin with fierce energy, as if she could scrub away her humiliation along with the dust. She found a certain satisfaction in bringing order to the neglected space. The physical labor kept darker thoughts at bay. By midday, Thomas returned from checking his cattle to find the main room transformed. Floors swept, surfaces dusted, everything arranged with care. You didn't have to do all this, he said, sounding almost distressed. I wanted to, Charlotte replied simply. Being busy helps. Thomas nodded as if he understood perfectly. Got some mending if you're looking for more to do. Shirts mostly. Never was much good with a needle. That afternoon, as Charlotte sat on the porch carefully repairing a worn shirt, she noticed Thomas watching her from where he worked in the corral. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of puzzled wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, returning to his task with renewed focus. That night, Charlotte slept more easily. Whatever happened next, she at least had these few days to gather her strength and make plans. Maybe this strange detour was a blessing in disguise. Time to consider her next steps rather than rushing back east in shame. On the second morning, Thomas mentioned needing to check his western fence line. Might be gone most of the day, he said over breakfast. Will you be all right here alone? Of course, Charlotte assured him. I'm quite capable of looking after myself. He nodded, looking relieved not to have to worry about entertaining her. If anyone comes by, not that they would, just tell them I'll be back by sundown. Charlotte watched him ride away, a solitary figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. How empty his life seemed. Yet he'd opened his home to a stranger without hesitation. She was halfway through baking bread when hoofbeats announced a visitor. Through the window, Charlotte saw an expensive buggy pull up, driven by a well-dressed man she instantly recognized from his photographs, Willard Harrison. Her stomach knotted as she wiped flour from her hands. What could he possibly want? Harrison tied his horse and approached the cabin, his polished boots incongruous against the dusty yard. Charlotte stepped onto the porch before he could knock, unwilling to let him enter what had briefly become her sanctuary. "Miss Edwards," Harrison said, removing his hat to reveal thinning hair pomaded flat against his skull. Up close, he looked older than in his photographs, with hard eyes despite his practiced smile. "I've come to rectify a misunderstanding." Charlotte clasped her hands to hide their trembling. "I believe the situation was made perfectly clear at the station, Mr. Harrison." "A regrettable incident," he said smoothly. "Business concerns required my attention. But I've reconsidered." Charlotte felt cold despite the warm day. "Reconsidered?" Harrison stepped closer, lowering his voice confidentially. "You're an attractive woman, Miss Edwards. Perhaps not suitable as a banker's wife. Your background is rather rustic, after all. But I might have another arrangement to propose." The implication hung in the air between them. Charlotte's shock quickly turned to white-hot anger. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "I came west as a respectable woman answering an advertisement for marriage. I remain a respectable woman despite your rejection. If you're suggesting what I think you are, please leave immediately." Harrison's smile vanished. "You misunderstand your position. This territory has few options for unmarried women without means or connections. Blackwell can't keep you forever. What will you do when your money runs out? My offer is practical, nothing more." "My arrangements are no longer your concern," Charlotte replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Good day, Mr. Harrison." Harrison's face darkened. "Living alone with Blackwell hasn't damaged your reputation already? People are talking, Miss Edwards." "Let them talk," Charlotte said, though her heart pounded at the truth in his words. "Mr. Blackwell has shown me nothing but kindness and respect, something you know nothing about." "You'll regret this self-righteousness," Harrison said, jamming his hat back on his head. "Blackwell's already on thin ice with the bank. Don't think your presence here will help his situation." As the buggy disappeared down the road, Charlotte sank onto the porch steps, shaking with reaction. What had she done? Had she just made an enemy of the most powerful man in the area? And worse, had she now put Thomas in danger because of her pride? When Thomas returned at sunset, Charlotte hesitated to tell him about Harrison's visit. But as they sat down to supper, she knew she couldn't keep it from him. "Mr. Harrison came today," she said simply. Thomas went still, his fork halfway to his mouth. What did he want? Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks. To make an alternative arrangement, one no decent woman would accept. Thomas's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "I see. I refused him, of course," Charlotte continued. "But he made threats. About the bank. About your mortgage." Thomas set down his fork with deliberate care. "Don't worry about that. Harrison's been looking for reasons to foreclose on me for years. This isn't your burden." "But it is," Charlotte insisted. If you hadn't come here, I'd still be at odds with Harrison," Thomas interrupted. "Man's had it in for me since I spoke against his development plans for the creek that feeds half the ranches in the valley." Charlotte studied him with new eyes. This quiet man had stood against someone like Harrison? "You risked your ranch to protect others' water rights?" Thomas shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her attention. "It was the right thing. Water belongs to everyone, not just those with money." Something shifted in Charlotte's understanding of the man across the table. Thomas Blackwell wasn't just a lonely rancher who'd taken pity on her. He was a man of principles, willing to stand against power when necessary. "The train comes tomorrow," Charlotte said softly. Thomas nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know." They finished their meal in silence, each lost in thoughts neither was ready to share. As darkness fell outside, Charlotte wondered what awaited her beyond this brief, unexpected haven, and why the thought of leaving suddenly felt more like loss than escape. Charlotte couldn't sleep. The moonlight spilled through the thin curtains as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. Tomorrow's train would carry her away from this place. Back to what? Shame? Poverty? Her brother's wife's contempt? Thunder rumbled in the distance. The weather had been turning all evening, dark clouds building on the horizon like a warning. Charlotte slipped from bed and padded to the window. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the yard, the barn, the distant hills. She'd already packed her valise. Not that unpacking had taken long. 2 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, and the small photograph of her parents were her only possessions. The letter from her brother with the money for a fresh start elsewhere was tucked safely in her pocket. Enough to get her to Denver, perhaps, or California. Another rumble closer now. The wind picked up, rattling the window frame. Charlotte hugged herself against a sudden chill. In just hours, she would leave this strange interlude behind. She should feel relieved. Instead, a hollow sensation spread through her chest. Thomas had been so quiet at supper, even more than usual. After Harrison's visit and her revelation about it, something had changed between them. Not just the banker's threats. Something else, something unspoken that hung in the air like the coming storm. A crash from outside startled her. Charlotte rushed to the window again. In the next lightning flash, she saw the barn door swinging wildly, torn from its top hinge by the wind. Rain began pelting the glass like tiny stones. Without thinking, Charlotte grabbed the woolen shawl from the foot of her bed and hurried through the main room. Thomas was already up, pulling on his boots. "Stay inside," he warned, reaching for his coat. "I need to secure the animals." "I'll help," Charlotte said, wrapping the shawl tightly around her shoulders. Thomas started to protest, but another violent gust rattled the cabin. "All right, stay close." The moment they stepped outside, the storm's fury hit them full force. Rain lashed sideways, soaking Charlotte's nightdress beneath her shawl in seconds. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet as they struggled toward the barn. Inside, the horses whinnied nervously, stomping and tossing their heads. The damaged door banged repeatedly, threatening to tear completely free. "Hold this," Thomas shouted over the storm, handing Charlotte a lantern. He wrestled with the heavy door, trying to force it back into position. "There's rope on that hook. Grab it." Charlotte fumbled for the coiled rope, her cold fingers clumsy with haste. Together, they managed to secure the door temporarily, though it still rattled ominously with each gust. "The creek," Thomas said suddenly, his face tight with worry in the lantern light. "If it floods, it could take out the bridge." The bridge, the only direct route to town. To the train station. How bad could it get? Charlotte asked, pushing wet hair from her face. "Bad enough." Thomas's gaze was grave. Last big storm washed out every crossing for 10 miles. Charlotte's heart sank. How long to repair? Days. Maybe longer. The implications hung between them. If the bridge washed out, Charlotte would be stranded here, perhaps for weeks. The thought should have horrified her. Instead, she felt a strange flutter of what? Relief? Before she could examine the feeling, a deafening crack split the air. Through the barn's small window, they saw a flash of white as lightning struck a tree near the house. "Fire!" Charlotte gasped, pointing to where sparks had ignited the dry brush beneath the tree. They raced from the barn, fighting the wind. The growing flames licked hungrily at the grass, driven toward the house by the wind. "The well!" Thomas shouted, running for the water bucket. "Form a line." For the next hour, they battled the flames together. Charlotte's arms ached from passing buckets. Her lungs burned from smoke, but she never faltered. Finally, the rain became an ally, helping to douse the last embers. Exhausted and drenched, they stumbled back to the cabin. Inside, water had seeped under the door, forming puddles on the wooden floor. Charlotte grabbed a rag and knelt to mop it up. "Leave it," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "You're shaking." Only then did Charlotte realize how cold she was, her nightdress plastered to her skin, her fingers numb. Thomas disappeared into his room and returned with a blanket, which he draped carefully around her shoulders. "You should change," he said, turning away with careful propriety. "I'll make coffee." When Charlotte emerged from her room in her brown dress, the blue one too sodden to wear, Thomas had a fire blazing in the hearth and coffee steaming in 2 mugs. "Thank you," she said, taking the offered cup. Their fingers brushed, and Charlotte felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the storm's fury gradually lessen outside. "You saved my house," Thomas said finally. "Not many would have run toward a fire like that." Charlotte smiled faintly. "I grew up fighting nature's whims on our farm. Fire, flood, drought, they were just part of life." "Your family's farm in Pennsylvania," Thomas said. "You mentioned it before." Charlotte nodded, surprised he remembered that small detail. "My father built it from nothing. We had 60 acres, mostly wheat, some vegetables, a few dairy cows." The memories came easier now, shared in the warm firelight with the storm raging outside. "When he died 4 years ago, my brother William took over. And then William married," Thomas guessed, putting the pieces together. "Sarah." Charlotte's mouth tightened. She made it clear there was no place for a spinster sister in their home. When the harvests failed 2 years running, it became a matter of practicality. "So you answered Harrison's advertisement." "One of several," Charlotte admitted. His was the only reply. She stared into her coffee. "How foolish I must seem to you." "Brave," Thomas countered. "Not foolish." Charlotte looked up, surprised. "Brave. Starting fresh in a strange place takes courage. Standing up to Harrison took courage." His eyes held hers. "You're many things, Charlotte Edwards, but foolish isn't one of them." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. 2 people who had faced loss and continued on, however imperfectly. "The bridge will likely be out by morning," Thomas said, breaking the spell. "If you still want to catch that train, we should leave now, try to cross before it's gone completely." Charlotte looked toward the window where rain still pounded against the glass. "Leave now? Rush through the storm on dangerous roads, just to return east in defeat? Or to some new place equally unknown but without what? Without Thomas Blackwell's quiet strength? Without this strange peace she'd found in his spare room? Without the purpose she'd discovered in bringing order to his neglected home? "I think," she said slowly, "that would be foolish. The roads will be dangerous." She met his gaze steadily. "If you're willing to tolerate my presence a while longer, I'd prefer to wait until conditions improve." Something like relief flickered in Thomas's eyes. "It's no hardship," he said simply. Later, Charlotte lay in bed listening to the storm gradually fade. The bridge would almost certainly be damaged, perhaps completely washed away. She might be here for days, even weeks. And as she drifted toward sleep, Charlotte realized she wasn't sorry at all. Morning revealed the storm's destruction. Branches littered the yard, the garden was partially flattened, and as Thomas had predicted, the bridge was gone. Nothing remained but a few splintered pilings jutting from the swollen creek. "For days to repair minimum," Thomas said when he returned from checking. "That's if the rain holds off." Charlotte nodded, feeling strangely calm. "Then I'll have time to fix that shirt of yours properly. The mending I did will never hold." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "No rush." Days slipped by in a rhythm neither had expected. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, Charlotte tending the house and garden, Thomas handling the livestock and repairs. In the evenings, they shared simple meals and simpler conversation. Gradually, the awkwardness between them eased. On the 3rd day, Charlotte found a trunk in the storage shed while searching for canning jars. Inside were women's clothes, simple dresses, aprons, a winter coat. "My wife's," Thomas said when she hesitantly asked. His voice was quiet but not pained, as if speaking of someone from a distant memory rather than a raw wound. "Eleanor. She's been gone 12 years now." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, closing the trunk quickly. "I shouldn't have pried." "No," Thomas said, It's time they were used again. She would have liked you, I think. The words hung in the air between them, filled with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. That night, Charlotte lay awake long after Thomas had retired to his room. The clothes in that trunk told a story of love, of loss, of a life interrupted. 12 years Thomas had lived alone, keeping those dresses carefully preserved. 12 years of solitude in this house built for a family. What would it be like, she wondered, to be loved so steadfastly? Harrison had discarded her before even meeting her. Her brother had chosen his wife's comfort over his sister's welfare. But Thomas Blackwell had kept his wife's memory alive for 12 years. Charlotte turned on her side, watching moonlight filter through the curtains. The bridge would be repaired soon. She would have to decide stay or go. And for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, Charlotte realized she had a genuine choice. You've got no right. The red-faced man slammed his meaty fist on the wooden counter, making the jars of candy rattle. No right at all to spread such filth about decent folk. Thomas stepped back, keeping a careful distance from Frank Peterson, the blacksmith whose wife was Millbrook's most notorious gossip. A crowd had gathered at Jenkins' general store, pretending interest in the merchandise while straining to hear every word. Never said a word about you or yours, Frank, Thomas replied evenly, though his jaw tightened. Now step aside. I've supplies to buy. It had been 10 days since the storm. 10 days of unexpected peace with Charlotte at the ranch. The bridge had been repaired faster than expected. 4 days instead of the predicted week. But still, Charlotte had stayed. Neither had mentioned the eastbound train that had come and gone twice now. Today was Thomas's first trip to town since before the storm, and the reception had been exactly what he'd feared. My Eunice says your guest is still there, Peterson continued, making the word guest sound foul. Indecent is what it is, taking advantage of a woman with no options. Heat rose in Thomas's face. Miss Edwards is a respectable woman who needed shelter after Harrison abandoned his obligations. She stays of her own free will as my housekeeper. Laughter erupted from the corner where Jackson Davis, Harrison's business partner, stood with several cronies. Housekeeper, is that what they're calling it these days? Thomas's hands curled into fists. He'd expected gossip, but not this level of open hostility. That's enough, came a firm voice. Pastor Whitaker pushed through the crowded store, his normally gentle face stern. This town should be ashamed, spreading rumors about a woman none of you have bothered to help. But Pastor, Mrs. Jenkins protested from behind the counter. A single woman living with a bachelor. While you all whisper and judge, I've actually met Miss Edwards, the pastor interrupted. She joined us for services last Sunday while Mr. Blackwell tended his cattle. A more proper, God-fearing woman you'd be hard-pressed to find. Thomas blinked in surprise. Charlotte had gone to church? She hadn't mentioned it. Furthermore, the pastor continued, Miss Edwards has accepted a temporary position teaching at our school until a permanent replacement for Mrs. Holloway can be found. This news hit Thomas like a physical blow. Charlotte was taking a teaching position? When had this happened? Why hadn't she told him? Now, Pastor Whitaker said, turning to Thomas. I believe you had shopping to do, Mr. Blackwell? The crowd reluctantly parted. Thomas completed his purchases in tense silence, aware of the whispers that followed him. Outside, the pastor fell into step beside him. Miss Edwards asked me not to mention the teaching position until it was finalized, he explained quietly. The school board only confirmed it yesterday. I see, Thomas said, though he didn't, not really. Why would Charlotte keep this from him? She's staying at my sister's boarding house starting tomorrow, Pastor Whitaker added. I've arranged it personally. Another shock. Charlotte was leaving the ranch? Without a word to him? Miss Edwards is quite remarkable, the pastor continued, oblivious to Thomas's inner turmoil. Her education and poise impressed everyone on the board. We're fortunate she's decided to remain in Millbrook. Thomas loaded his supplies mechanically, his mind racing. Yes, he managed. Fortunate. The ride home seemed endless. Charlotte was leaving. Not just his home but his life. She'd made plans, arrangements, all without a word to him. After 10 days of shared meals and conversations, of working side by side, of gradually breaking down the walls between them. Had he imagined the connection growing between them? The way her eyes sought his across the table, the way her hand sometimes lingered near his when passing the coffee, the way she'd begun humming while working, as if happiness had crept up on her unawares? When the ranch came into view, Thomas saw Charlotte in the garden, gathering late vegetables. Sunlight caught her hair, turning it to gold. She'd taken to wearing one of Eleanor's old dresses, altered to fit her smaller frame while working. The sight of her there, so naturally a part of his world, tightened Thomas's chest. She looked up at the sound of the wagon, smiling and waving. How could she smile knowing she was leaving? How could she wave so casually when she'd been making plans to walk away? "You're back earlier than expected," Charlotte called as he pulled the horses to a stop. "I've made stew for—" She broke off, seeing his expression. "What's wrong? When were you going to tell me?" Thomas asked, the words coming out harsher than intended. Charlotte's smile faded. "Tell you what? About the teaching position. About moving to the boarding house." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Pastor Whitaker told you. Had to hear it from him instead of you." Thomas jumped down from the wagon, not offering his hand as he usually did. "When were you planning to mention it?" "As you were walking out the door." Hurt flashed across Charlotte's face. "I was going to tell you tonight. The board only confirmed it yesterday afternoon while you were checking the north pasture." "And the boarding house? How long have you been planning that?" "I haven't been planning anything," Charlotte said, her own temper rising. "Pastor Whitaker offered it yesterday. I only accepted this morning by letter." Thomas turned away, busying himself with unhitching the horses. "Well, congratulations on your position. Millbrook will be lucky to have you." "Thomas," Charlotte's voice softened, "I was going to discuss it with you properly tonight. I wanted to explain." "No need to explain," Thomas interrupted. "You found a respectable position, respectable lodging. Makes perfect sense. If you'd just listen. We should get these supplies unloaded before dark," he said, deliberately changing the subject. "Storm's coming in from the west. Might be a bad one." Charlotte stared at him for a long moment, then nodded stiffly. Of course. They worked in tense silence, unloading supplies and securing the animals. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, like the electricity of the approaching storm. That evening, supper was a quiet affair. Charlotte had indeed made stew, Thomas's favorite, with dumplings on top, but he barely tasted it. Every bite felt like goodbye. "Thomas," Charlotte finally said, setting down her spoon, "I need to explain about the teaching position." "As I said, no explanation needed," Thomas replied, still not meeting her eyes. "It's a good opportunity. Will you stop being so stubborn and listen?" Charlotte's palm slapped the table, startling them both. "I didn't seek out this position. Pastor Whitaker approached me after services last Sunday." Thomas looked up, surprised by her outburst. "You went to church?" "Yes, while you were checking the cattle. I wanted to." She hesitated. "I wanted to see if Millbrook could be a place I might belong." The simple admission hung in the air between them. The pastor introduced me to several people, including Mrs. Holloway, who mentioned she was returning east to care for her ailing mother. When she learned I had experience teaching farm children, she suggested I might be a suitable temporary replacement. "Temporary," Thomas repeated, focusing on that one word. "Until spring, when they can find someone permanent." Charlotte's eyes searched his. "I never planned to stay in Millbrook, Thomas. You know that. But I also never planned to meet someone like you." The words hung between them, charged with meaning. "When the pastor offered the boarding house," Charlotte continued carefully, "I accepted because of the talk in town, because my staying here is damaging your reputation." "I don't care about gossip," Thomas said, "but I care about you." The words came out in a rush. "These past 10 days have been—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Before Thomas could respond, a pounding at the door interrupted them. He opened it to find Elijah Jones, the station master, on the porch, rain dripping from his hat. "Thomas, you're needed in town," he said breathlessly. "It's Harrison. He's called in your loan. Says you've got 3 days to pay in full or he takes the ranch." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "That's impossible. I've made every payment on time." "He says there's a clause about moral character in the fine print," Elijah explained uncomfortably, glancing toward Charlotte. "Says you've violated it." "That's outrageous." Charlotte stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Mr. Blackwell has done nothing wrong." "Don't matter," Elijah said sadly. "Harrison owns the bank, makes the rules." 3 days, Thomas repeated numbly. "That's not enough time to raise that kind of money." "That's the point," Charlotte said quietly. "Harrison knows you can't pay. This is about me. About me refusing his proposition." Understanding dawned on Thomas's face, followed quickly by fury. "Harrison thinks he can drive you out by threatening my ranch. And he's using me as the excuse," Charlotte finished. "Oh, Thomas, I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "No." Thomas's voice was firm. "This is Harrison's doing, not yours." Elijah shifted uncomfortably. "Town meeting tomorrow at noon. Harrison's bringing it before the business association. Thought you should know." After Elijah left, Thomas and Charlotte stood in silence, the implications of this new threat hanging between them. "I'll leave first thing in the morning," Charlotte finally said. "Move to the boarding house early. Perhaps if I'm not here." "Running won't solve this," Thomas interrupted. "Harrison won't stop. He wants the ranch, has for years. This is just his latest excuse." "But if I leave Millbrook completely, is that what you want?" Thomas asked, his eyes finding hers. "To leave?" Charlotte hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Thomas saw the truth. Despite everything, the scandal, the gossip, Harrison's threats, she wanted to stay, not just in Millbrook, but here with him. "No," she whispered. "It's not what I want." Thomas took a step toward her, then another, until barely a foot separated them. "What do you want, Charlotte?" Instead of answering, Charlotte closed the distance between them, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. The simple contact held more meaning than 1,000 words. "I want to stay," she said simply, "but not at the cost of your ranch." Thomas covered her hand with his own. "Then we fight," he said. "Together." Outside, the storm broke at last, rain lashing against the windows. But inside, something else entirely had broken. The final barrier between two wounded hearts finding unexpected sanctuary in each other. As Thomas gently drew Charlotte into his arms, neither spoke of the challenges facing them. Harrison's threats, the town's judgment, the uncertain future. For this moment, it was enough to acknowledge the truth that had been growing between them since that first day at the train station. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The town hall buzzed with angry voices. Thomas stood at the back, his hat in his hands, watching as Willard Harrison commanded the room from behind the mayor's desk. Charlotte waited outside. They'd agreed it would be better if she didn't attend. This fight was Thomas's to face. "It's a simple matter of community standards," Harrison was saying, his voice smooth as silk. "Blackwell has openly flouted decency by housing an unmarried woman. The moral character clause in his loan agreement is quite clear." Thomas studied the faces around him. Some neighbors avoided his eyes, uncomfortable with the public accusation. Others nodded along with Harrison's words, their judgment already decided. A few, like old Jim Cooper who owned the livery stable, looked skeptical. 3 days isn't reasonable time to repay a loan of that size, Jim spoke up. "Man's never missed a payment." Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The terms were agreed upon when Mr. Blackwell signed the papers. The bank is simply exercising its rights." "Seems mighty convenient timing," Jim pressed. "Right when you're looking to expand your cattle operation west of town. Right where Blackwell's ranch sits." A murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas hadn't known about Harrison's expansion plans, but it made perfect sense. His land bordered the creek water access Harrison would need. My business dealings are not the subject of this meeting, Harrison said sharply. The subject is Blackwell's flagrant disregard for propriety. That's not true. All heads turned as Pastor Whitaker stood. Miss Edwards is a woman of impeccable character who found herself in difficult circumstances through no fault of her own. Mr. Blackwell offered Christian charity when no one, including you, Mr. Harrison, would help. The nature of their arrangement, Harrison began, is above reproach, the pastor interrupted firmly. I've visited the ranch myself. Miss Edwards has separate quarters and serves as housekeeper while awaiting more permanent arrangements, which she has now secured as our new schoolteacher. This revelation caused another wave of whispers. The pastor's endorsement carried weight, especially with the church-going townsfolk. Harrison's face darkened momentarily before he regained his composure. Nevertheless, the loan agreement stands. 3 days, Blackwell. Then the ranch is forfeit. As the meeting broke up, several people approached Thomas, including Jim Cooper and the pastor. This isn't right, Jim said, shaking his head. Man can't call in a loan like that without cause. He can if it's in the contract, Thomas replied grimly. And it probably is, buried in the fine print. You could challenge it in court, Pastor Whitaker suggested. Thomas gave a humorless laugh. The nearest circuit judge won't be through for 2 months. By then, Harrison will own my land. What about selling some cattle? Jim asked. Might raise enough to cover part of it. Maybe a quarter, Thomas said. And nobody around here has cash to buy right now, not with winter coming. As they stepped outside, Thomas saw Charlotte waiting anxiously by the hitching post. Her face fell as she read his expression. It didn't go well, she guessed. Before Thomas could answer, a commotion erupted down the street. A rider was galloping into town, his horse lathered and heaving. Fire! The man shouted. Prairie fire coming from the south. Moving fast. Instant panic. Prairie fires were every farmer's nightmare, especially after the dry summer they'd had. With the right wind, flames could race faster than a horse could run, consuming everything in their path. The town sprang into action. Men grabbed shovels and burlap sacks from the general store. Women filled buckets at the town pump. Children were rushed to the brick schoolhouse for safety. My ranch, Thomas said, suddenly pale. It's directly in the path if the fire's coming from the south. He turned to Charlotte, his eyes urgent. Stay here where it's safe. I need to try to save what I can. Charlotte gripped his arm. I'm coming with you. Charlotte. We don't have time to argue, she said firmly. 2 people have a better chance than 1. They rode hard, the smell of smoke growing stronger as they neared the ranch. The horizon had turned an ominous orange-red, dark smoke billowing upward. As they crested the final hill, Thomas pulled his horse to a stop, his heart sinking. The fire was less than a mile away, a wall of flame advancing relentlessly across the dry grass. The wind was driving it straight toward his land. We need to create a firebreak, Thomas said, jumping from his horse. There's no time to save everything. We focus on the house and barn. For the next hour, they worked frantically, digging up the earth in a wide strip around the buildings, wetting down the roofs with bucket after bucket from the well. Thomas released the horses from the corral, knowing they'd run to safety on instinct. The heat grew unbearable as the fire drew closer. Ash fell like black snow. Charlotte's face was streaked with soot, her clothes damp with sweat, but she never slowed. The hay! Thomas suddenly remembered. If the barn catches, I'll move it. Charlotte was already running toward the barn. No! Thomas shouted. It's too dangerous. But she was already inside. Thomas cursed and ran after her. The dry hay was stacked against the far wall, the most vulnerable spot if sparks reached the barn. Together, they dragged heavy bales away from the walls, creating a safer space in the center. The air grew thicker with smoke. Charlotte started coughing. That's enough, Thomas said, pulling her toward the door. We've done what we can. Outside, the roar of the fire was deafening. The flames had reached the edge of Thomas's property, consuming the tall grass with frightening speed. The firebreak they'd created seemed pathetically small against such power. "Will it hold?" Charlotte asked, her voice hoarse from smoke. "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "Depends on the wind." As if in answer, the wind suddenly shifted, just slightly but enough. The flames veered southeastward, still consuming the outer fields but missing the direct path to the house and barn. For hours they stood vigil, beating out smaller fires that jumped the break, refilling buckets, watching as the main blaze gradually moved past them. By nightfall, the immediate danger had passed, though pockets still burned in the distance. They sat exhausted on the porch steps, faces blackened with soot, lungs raw from smoke. Around them, the land was transformed, charred black where lush grass had been. Nearly half of Thomas's grazing land was destroyed. "My cattle," Thomas said numbly. "They'll have nothing to eat." Charlotte placed a hand on his arm. "We'll figure something out." Thomas looked at her through red-rimmed eyes. "We?" She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, we. I'm not going anywhere, Thomas. Not now." The simple declaration hung between them, more binding than any formal promise. "Harrison will take the ranch in 2 days," Thomas reminded her. "Fire or no fire." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then, "What if he couldn't?" "What do you mean?" "Pastor Whitaker said something at church about Harrison's bank being examined by government inspectors next week. Something about new banking regulations." Thomas straightened. "Harrison never mentioned that." "Maybe that's why he's in such a hurry to call in your loan," Charlotte suggested, "before anyone can look too closely at his practices." For the first time in days, Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. "If we could delay just a week." "Exactly," Charlotte said. "We just need time." As darkness settled fully over the burned landscape, they began to form a plan. One born of desperation, perhaps, but a plan nonetheless. One that might just save everything they'd both come to cherish. And as Thomas looked at Charlotte in the fading light, her determination matching his own, he realized something. This woman who had arrived with nothing had somehow given him everything that mattered. Willard Harrison slapped his riding crop against his polished boot, his impatience growing with each passing minute. The bank clock showed 5 minutes to noon, the deadline for Thomas Blackwell to pay his loan or forfeit his ranch. "He's not coming," Davis, Harrison's business partner, said with satisfaction. "Smart man would know when he's beaten." Harrison wasn't so sure. Something about Blackwell's calm at the town meeting had bothered him. The man should have been desperate, pleading for more time. Instead, he'd been almost confident. And then there was the matter of Charlotte Edwards. Harrison still burned with humiliation at her rejection. Women didn't refuse Willard Harrison, especially not penniless spinsters with no prospects. Yet she had, and chosen a dirt-poor rancher instead. "Sir," the bank clerk interrupted his thoughts. "There's someone here to see you." Harrison turned, expecting Blackwell, but instead found himself facing Judge Wilson, the circuit judge who wasn't due in town for another month. "Judge," Harrison said, recovering quickly from his surprise. "This is unexpected. We weren't expecting you until—" "I received an urgent letter regarding bank practices in Millbrook," the judge said, his stern face revealing nothing. "Seemed important enough to adjust my circuit." Harrison's mouth went dry. The banking inspectors weren't due for another week. He'd planned to have Blackwell's land secured by then, the questionable loans hidden in legitimate transactions. "I'm conducting official business today," Harrison said smoothly. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow." The bank door opened again. This time it was Blackwell with Charlotte Edwards beside him. Behind them came Pastor Whitaker and Jim Cooper, and most surprising of all, Edward Thompson, president of the larger regional bank in Henderson County. "Right on time," Judge Wilson said, checking his pocket watch. "Shall we proceed with this hearing?" "Hearing?" Harrison sputtered. "What hearing?" "Concerning your bank's lending practices, specifically calling in loans without proper cause," the judge replied calmly. "Mr. Thompson has kindly agreed to review your books as an expert witness." Harrison felt the blood drain from his face. "This is ridiculous." Blackwell signed a contract with a moral character clause. He violated it by housing an unmarried woman. About that, Pastor Whitaker stepped forward. I've brought the church registry. Perhaps you'd care to examine it, Judge. The judge accepted the large book, flipping to where the pastor indicated. He read aloud, Thomas Blackwell and Charlotte Edwards, married September 20th, 1885. Witnesses James Cooper and Elijah Jones. Harrison stared at Charlotte in disbelief. That's impossible. You weren't married 3 days ago. We were married the evening after the town meeting, Charlotte said calmly. A private ceremony at the ranch. Very private, Harrison sneered. Conveniently so. Not at all, the pastor replied. Mr. Cooper and Mr. Jones were present, along with my wife. The ceremony was properly conducted and recorded. Harrison turned to his clerk. Get the Blackwell loan documents. Now. While the clerk scurried to obey, Harrison glared at Thomas. This changes nothing. The loan is still due today. That's where I come in, Thompson said, stepping forward. Henderson County Bank is prepared to assume Mr. Blackwell's loan at the proper terms, 30 years at the agreed-upon interest rate, without any moral character clause. Harrison felt trapped. If he refused, the judge would question why. If that led to a full examination of his books. This is highly irregular, he protested weakly. So is using a moral clause to seize property you want for your own expansion, Judge Wilson observed dryly. Yes, Mr. Cooper informed me of your plans for Blackwell's water rights. For a long moment, the bank was silent. Harrison looked from face to face, searching for a way out. Finding none, he nodded stiffly to his clerk. Process the loan transfer, he said through clenched teeth. As papers were signed and terms agreed upon, Harrison watched Charlotte standing confidently beside Thomas. No longer the frightened, rejected bride who'd stepped off the train, but a woman who had found her place and her power. You'll regret this, he muttered as they prepared to leave. Both of you. Charlotte turned to him, her blue eyes clear and unafraid. No, Mr. Harrison. The only regret here is yours, for underestimating what people will do to protect what matters. Later that evening, Thomas and Charlotte sat on their porch, watching the sunset over the blackened fields that would, with time and care, grow green again. Mrs. Blackwell, Thomas said, the name still new and wonderful on his tongue. I never properly asked you to marry me, did I? Charlotte smiled, taking his rough hand in hers. You didn't need to. When the pastor suggested a quick marriage might solve our legal problems, your face said everything. Thomas looked abashed. Not very romantic. It was practical, Charlotte replied. Like us. Thomas turned to face her fully. But you deserve romance too. You deserve to be asked properly. He took both her hands in his. Charlotte Edwards Blackwell, will you stay married to me? Not just for convenience or to save the ranch, but because I've come to love you. Charlotte's eyes shimmered in the fading light. I already have, she whispered. But yes, Thomas, 1,000 times yes. As darkness settled over the land, they remained on the porch, planning the future they would build together. She with her teaching position in town, he with his ranch to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. And much later, when the stars emerged in full brilliance above them, Thomas marveled at how close he'd come to missing this. How a simple act of kindness at a train station had changed everything. What are you thinking? Charlotte asked, her head resting against his shoulder. That sometimes life's greatest blessings arrive disguised as disappointments, Thomas replied. And that I'm thankful every day for Harrison's rejection letter. Charlotte laughed, the sound carrying across the night. So am I, she said. So am I. Inside the house that was now truly a home, a lamp burned warmly in the window, a beacon in the darkness, much like the hope that had grown between two lonely souls who had found each other against all odds. Winter came early to Millbrook that year. October wasn't half over when the first snow dusted the plains, a warning of the harsh months ahead. Charlotte watched the white flakes swirl outside the schoolhouse window, wondering how Thomas was managing at the ranch. The fire had burned nearly half their grazing land, forcing difficult decisions about which cattle to keep and which to sell at rock-bottom prices. "Mrs. Blackwell?" A small voice pulled Charlotte from her thoughts. "I finished my sums." 8-year-old Mary Taylor stood beside Charlotte's desk, slate in hand, her face serious with concentration. Charlotte smiled and took the slate, quickly checking the neat rows of numbers. "Excellent work, Mary," she said warmly. "You're making wonderful progress." Pride bloomed on the little girl's face as she hurried back to her seat. Charlotte looked around the one-room schoolhouse at her 12 students, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. In just 2 months, she'd grown to love each one, from shy little Peter Cooper to spirited Emma Jenkins. When the position had changed from temporary to permanent last month, Mrs. Holloway deciding to stay back east with her ailing mother, Charlotte had felt a curious mix of joy and uncertainty. Teaching gave her purpose, independence, respect in the community. But it also meant 5 days a week away from the ranch from Thomas. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Children gathered books and slates, bundling into coats and scarves against the early chill. "Remember your compositions are due tomorrow," Charlotte called over the excited chatter. "One full page on what you're most thankful for." As the last child disappeared through the door, Charlotte began her usual after-school routine. Straightening desks, cleaning the blackboard, banking the fire to keep pipes from freezing overnight. But today her heart wasn't in it. Thomas had seemed distant that morning when he dropped her off, preoccupied with worries he wouldn't share. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Charlotte turned, expecting a forgotten lunch pail or slate, but instead found Sarah Jenkins, the general store owner's wife and one of Millbrook's most prominent gossips. "Mrs. Blackwell," Sarah said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes, "I hope to catch you alone." Charlotte set down her chalk brush, wiping dust from her hands. "Mrs. Jenkins, what can I do for you?" Sarah closed the door behind her, shutting out the cold. "I'm here on behalf of the school board. There's been concern." Charlotte's stomach tightened. Mrs. Jenkins had opposed her appointment from the beginning, though the pastor's support had eventually won over the other board members. "What kind of concern?" Charlotte asked, keeping her voice level. "Your living arrangements," Sarah replied bluntly. "Commuting daily from that remote ranch, especially with winter coming. It's impractical and potentially dangerous." "My husband drives me when the weather's poor," Charlotte said. "We manage quite well." Sarah sniffed. "That's another matter. Your marriage was rather sudden, wasn't it? Right when Mr. Harrison called in that loan." The implication hung in the air between them. Charlotte felt heat rise in her face but kept her composure. "Mrs. Jenkins, my marriage is not the school board's concern. My teaching is. But it is our concern when our teacher might be snowed in for days, leaving children without instruction," Sarah countered. "The board feels you should take rooms in town during the week. Mrs. Wilson has space in her boarding house." Charlotte stared at the woman in disbelief. "You expect me to live apart from my husband 5 days a week?" "Many teachers do," Sarah said with false sympathy. "It's quite common." Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened again, bringing a blast of cold air and Thomas with it. He removed his hat, nodding politely to Mrs. Jenkins. "Afternoon, ma'am. Hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Sarah said, her tone suddenly honeyed. "I was just discussing some school board business with Mrs. Blackwell." Thomas's eyes found Charlotte's, reading her distress instantly. "Anything I should know about?" Charlotte hesitated, then decided truth was best. "Mrs. Jenkins says the board wants me to stay in town during the week. They're concerned about winter travel." Something flashed in Thomas's eyes, hurt, perhaps, or anger, but his face remained calm. "I see. And did the full board vote on this?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we haven't had a formal meeting yet, but then perhaps this discussion should wait until they do," Thomas suggested mildly. "Charlotte and I have some news of our own to share with the community soon, which might affect these concerns." Sarah's eyes narrowed with instant curiosity. "News?" Thomas smiled, offering nothing more. "If you'll excuse us, Mrs. Jenkins, The snow's picking up, and we should head home before the roads worsen. After Sarah left, clearly burning with unanswered questions, Charlotte turned to Thomas. What news? What are you talking about? Thomas took her hands in his. I was going to wait until we got home, make it special. But then I saw that woman upsetting you, and he took a deep breath. Jim Cooper offered me a partnership in the livery stable. We'd own half, work together. Charlotte's eyes widened. But the ranch. We'd keep the house, the immediate land, Thomas explained, but sell most of the grazing land to the Hendersons. They've been wanting to expand. But you love ranching, Charlotte said softly. Thomas squeezed her hands. I love you more. This way we'd both be in town. No more long commutes for you. No more worrying about snow or mud. We'd have a steady income while the ranch land recovers. The enormity of what he was offering washed over Charlotte. Thomas was willing to change his entire life, give up the independence he cherished for her. There's more, Thomas continued, his voice dropping lower. The livery has living quarters above the stable, bigger than our cabin. Room enough for. He paused, a hint of uncertainty crossing his face. For a family, if you wanted that. Charlotte's breath caught. They hadn't discussed children. After her hasty marriage to save the ranch, she hadn't dared hope for more. Thomas, she whispered, tears filling her eyes. Are you asking if I want children? He nodded, suddenly looking as vulnerable as she'd ever seen him. I know our start wasn't traditional, but these past months, Charlotte, you've brought life back to me. I want a future with you, a real one. Charlotte threw her arms around his neck, her heart too full for words. Thomas held her tightly, his strong hands gentle against her back. Is that a yes? He murmured against her hair. Charlotte leaned back to see his face, wiping tears from her cheeks. Yes, to all of it. The partnership, the move to town, the family. Yes. The ride home was filled with plans and possibilities. The Hendersons would pay enough for the grazing land to clear Thomas's remaining debt to the bank. The livery partnership would provide steady income through winter when ranching paid little. The rooms above the stable could be renovated before they moved in spring. As they approached the ranch, Charlotte noticed an unfamiliar horse tied at the hitching post. Thomas frowned, immediately alert. Stay in the wagon, he said, helping her down but keeping her behind him as they approached the house. The front door opened before they reached it. A tall man stood silhouetted against the lamplight inside. For a moment, Charlotte didn't recognize him, then gasped. William! Her brother stepped onto the porch, hat in hands, looking older than his 30 years. Hello, Charlotte. Thomas tensed beside her. You're Charlotte's brother? What brings you all the way from Pennsylvania? William's eyes never left Charlotte's face. I came to find my sister, to bring her home. Home, Charlotte repeated, the word hanging in the frigid air between them. William, I am home. Her brother's weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes, so like their father's, revealed his discomfort. This isn't what I meant when I sent money for a fresh start. Thomas stepped forward, offering his hand. Thomas Blackwell, Charlotte's husband. William hesitated before shaking it. William Edwards, surprised to hear my sister's married. Her letter mentioned teaching, not a husband. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. She hadn't written to William about her marriage, partly from pride, partly fearing he wouldn't understand how much had changed in just a few months. Let's get out of this cold, Thomas suggested, his voice carefully neutral. Whatever's brought you here, Mr. Edwards, you're welcome to warm yourself inside. The cabin felt smaller with William's tall frame filling the front room. He stood awkwardly, taking in the simple furnishings, the feminine touches Charlotte had added. Curtains sewn from flour sacks, a braided rug by the hearth, wildflowers pressed and framed on the wall. Coffee, Charlotte offered, hanging her coat and moving toward the kitchen. Routine tasks would help calm her racing heart. Please, William said, finally removing his hat. It's been a long journey. While Charlotte busied herself at the stove, The men engaged in stiff conversation. About the weather, the journey west, the early snow. Thomas asked polite questions about Pennsylvania, about farming conditions back east. William answered in short sentences, his eyes constantly drifting to Charlotte. When they were finally settled at the table with steaming mugs, William cleared his throat. "Sarah's gone." The simple statement fell like a stone. Charlotte set down her mug with a thump. "Gone? What do you mean?" "Left me. Ran off with a traveling salesman 2 months ago." William's voice was flat, emotionless. "Took what cash we had." "Oh, William," Charlotte said softly. "I'm so sorry." Her brother stared into his coffee. "Farm's failing. Bad harvests 3 years running now. Banks threatening foreclosure." Understanding dawned on Charlotte. "And you need help." William nodded, finally meeting her eyes. "I need you to come home, Charlotte. Help me save the farm. It's what Pa would have wanted." The irony wasn't lost on Charlotte, her brother, who had pushed her out at his wife's insistence, now wanting her back because that same wife had abandoned him. The farm he now called hers to save was the same one he'd made clear had no place for her. Thomas watched her face carefully, saying nothing. This was her decision to make. "William," Charlotte said gently, "I have a life here now, a husband, a teaching position. I can't just leave." "It's our family land," William pressed. "For generations of Edwards have worked that soil. And I was sent away from it." Charlotte reminded him, a flash of the old hurt surfacing. "You made it clear there was no place for me." "That was Sarah's doing," William protested. "You know I never wanted you to go." "But you let me," Charlotte said quietly. "You chose her happiness over my welfare." William had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them, years of unspoken hurt and resentment filling the small room. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Mr. Edwards, you've had a long journey. Why don't you rest tonight? Things often look clearer after sleep." Relief washed over William's tired face. "I'd be grateful." Later, after William had been settled in the spare room, the same room where Charlotte had first stayed as a stranded stranger, she and Thomas whispered together in their bedroom. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Thomas assured her, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Or tomorrow. Take the time you need." Charlotte pressed her cheek against his palm. "There's nothing to decide. My place is here with you." "He's your family," Thomas said gently. "Your only blood kin, from what you've told me." "And you're my family now," Charlotte replied. "The one I chose. The one who chose me." Morning brought a changed landscape. Snow had fallen heavily through the night, blanketing the burned prairie in pristine white. Charlotte rose early to prepare breakfast, her mind still turning over William's sudden appearance and request. She found her brother already awake, standing at the window watching the sunrise paint the snow in shades of pink and gold. "It's beautiful here," he admitted as she entered. "Different from home, but beautiful in its own way." Charlotte began stirring the fire back to life. "It grows on you." William turned from the window, his face solemn. "I meant what I said last night, Charlotte. I need you, but I understand now that I have no right to ask." Charlotte paused, surprised by his insight. "It's not about rights, William. It's about choices. My life is here now." William nodded, looking around the simple cabin with new eyes. "You've made something good. I can see that." "Yes," Charlotte agreed. "Against all odds, I have." William crossed to her, tentatively placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry, Charlotte, for letting Sarah push you away, for not standing up for you. I've regretted it every day since." The simple apology, so long awaited, brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. "I forgive you," she said softly. "We can't change the past, but perhaps we can build a better future." Thomas found them that way when he came in from tending the animals, brother and sister reconnecting across years of hurt, beginning to heal old wounds. Over breakfast, a new plan emerged, piece by piece. William would stay through winter, helping Thomas with the remaining livestock and preparations to sell the grazing land. Come spring, he would return east with enough money to make a fresh start. Not on the old family farm, which held too many painful memories, but perhaps further west in Ohio, where land was cheaper and opportunities more plentiful. You could teach there, William suggested to Charlotte. They're always needing school teachers in new settlements. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Thomas, who nodded slightly. Actually, William, we're hoping to start a family of our own soon. I'll continue teaching here until then. William's eyes widened, then a genuine smile, the first Charlotte had seen since his arrival, spread across his face. Children? I'd be an uncle? God willing, Thomas said, reaching for Charlotte's hand across the table. Then I'd best stay close enough to visit, William said. Ohio might be too far. The Wilsons are selling their place just outside town, Thomas suggested. Small house, 20 acres. Might suit a single man looking to start fresh. By Christmas, decisions had been made and plans set in motion. William purchased the Wilson property, a modest holding he could manage alone. Thomas and Charlotte prepared to move to town in spring, taking up the partnership with Jim Cooper and the rooms above the livery stable. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell softly outside, the three of them gathered around the hearth in the cabin that had witnessed so much change in a single year. A toast, William proposed, raising his cup of cider. To new beginnings. To family, Thomas added, his arm around Charlotte's shoulders. To home, Charlotte finished, looking around at the two men who represented her past and future, now beautifully reconciled in her present. Later that night, as Thomas slept beside her, Charlotte placed a hand on her stomach, where new life had just begun to grow. A secret she would share with him in the morning, her Christmas gift to the man who had seen her value when she'd been rejected by all others. Outside, the land rested beneath its winter blanket, awaiting spring's renewal. Inside, warmth and hope filled every corner of the small cabin that had started as a temporary shelter and become the foundation for a lifetime of love. In the years that followed, Millbrook would remember the story of Thomas Blackwell and his rejected bride. How a simple act of kindness at a train station had blossomed into the town's most enduring love story. How a wealthy banker's cruel rejection had led to the greatest blessing two lonely souls could imagine. How sometimes, life's deepest disappointments opened doors to its sweetest joys. And how what truly shocked everyone wasn't their unusual beginning, but how completely two broken lives could heal each other, creating something stronger and more beautiful than either could have built alone.